No role plays, no conference calls, no BS. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader. This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, in this episode, I want to talk about strategy.
Oh, I like to talk about strategy. Strategy is fun.
It is fun. It's as you move up in leadership roles, you know, we talk about the difference between tactical and strategic work. The more you move up in an organization, the more you become a leader of leaders, or, you know, move up within your career, the less of your day is spent doing tactical things and the more of your day is spent doing strategic things. And so when you're talking about creating strategies, this is a large part of the job of a leader, especially if your team is the one who has to execute these strategies. Hopefully you are involved in the creation of them, and hopefully you're involving your team in the creation of them too. The reason why I want to talk about it is that, you know, I've been in situations where a strategy was developed, and, you know, we had the right people in the room, and we got to kind of go through everything to make sure that it's the right strategy moving forward, and we go to execute it and it doesn't work. And somebody, either myself or somebody else, can be very quick to say, oh, well, it was clearly the wrong strategy. This part was missing, or that part was missing, or, you know, hindsight's 2020, we should have done this instead or that instead. And we can start picking apart the strategy itself. And I came across an article on LinkedIn by a person, his name is Dr. Marc Sniukas, and he had this kind of infograph that talks about how there are 7 things that can destroy a strategy that is otherwise a good strategy. And they have nothing to do with what the strategy is, but in actuality, how it's put together and how it's implemented and shaped and put out to people to be executed. And so I like this because there have been times in my past where a strategy that didn't work was cast aside and a new one was brought in, and that one didn't work either. And we didn't stop to think, well, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't the strategy that was wrong. Maybe it was the execution of it that was wrong. Maybe it was a way we put it together or made certain assumptions about who was involved, those kind of things. So I like this, and I think it's a good topic, especially if you're listening to this and part of your job is developing strategy that you know has to be executed.
Yeah, no, I love it because I think that, you know, over time, what you learn when it comes to developing strategy is that it does take a lot of kind of effort. It takes a lot of collaboration. It takes a lot of, you know, not just your own self-reflection about the strategy and your own opinions, but those of others as well. If you want this to be a solid strategy that's successful, it takes a good amount of investing in that strategy. And there are many times when you have kind of, you know, enough tenure and confidence in a role that you're just like, I can kind of like copy and paste this a little bit. Sure. I know this has worked before. I can go down the same exact plan. But to your point, like, I think it's so important always to learn from the strategy. Sometimes it is just execution, but there are parts of why it wasn't executed that I think you also need to think about. Like, where did the execution stop? Where did it hit a hurdle or a speed bump, or would it just completely hit a brick wall? Like, what was it that caused that to happen? And have you done enough due diligence to really understand and not just understand it, but be able to explain your strategy to someone, which I think is really, really important. My favorite mention of strategy, and anytime I can get a South Park reference into the show, I try to. But my favorite is the underwear gnomes. And it was like they had their little whiteboard, remember?
Yep.
Step 1, steal underwear. Step 2, I don't know. Step 3, profit. Right. And like that was the joke, was like,
sure.
we don't even know what we're doing or why we're doing it. But we feel this is going to lead to profit. And I think the same way sometimes with strategies is that we have an idea or we have a thought, or maybe we found some success in something similar before, and now we want to just implement that and we just assume it's going to work. And if you haven't thought about some of these things in the preface of your strategy, then I think you have to review them if you have an issue with the strategy being executed.
Right. It's the old, step 1 is this, step 2 is, something, and then step 3 is, yay, we won.
Exactly.
That something is something. Like that means something, and you have to figure out what that is and define it. That is true. There are a lot of people out there who they will validate their own strategy by talking about whatever the outcome is, but there really isn't a clear tie-in between the strategy and the outcome. It's just, this is the desired outcome, and so we're going to put a strategy in place and assume that will be the outcome. And I guess sometimes it works, but if you don't have a direct tie-in of how A plus B equals C, you can't just hope that it's going to turn out that way. This has to be actually executed in this way. The things that Dr. Sniukas talks about in this article, the first thing he talks about is inconsistency. And I like this because when I've seen a strategy not work because it is applied inconsistently, to me, what that says is that someone in the creation of the strategy felt differently about what was going to be done than other people did. You couldn't come to a consensus. You couldn't ask for a consensus. And so it was kind of tabled for later, or it was just assumed that whatever the decision was, that everybody was just going to abide by it. And then people leave the room and it's time to execute. And you'll have some people who absolutely disagree with the way that it was supposed to go. And then they'll do it their own way. They'll just decide arbitrarily in the moment to do it a different way. Now, that doesn't mean the strategy wasn't good. It means that it wasn't executed in a consistent way, and maybe that's why it failed. Or maybe they're right. And when the way that the consensus came to, maybe that was the wrong way, and the outlier was the one that was correct. But either way, what this says to me is that there wasn't a clear agreement with everybody in the room when it was the 1, 2, 3 ready break, where everybody kind of gets together and says, hey, you know what? I know that there's parts of all of our ideas in this. This is the strategy we've come to together. If there's a reason that you feel like you can't execute it exactly like we all discussed together, then let's just let's talk this out again, because the moment we leave here, we have to execute. And we have to all be able to rely on that, even if it wasn't exactly the way we wanted it to go, that we're all going to execute it in this way, because that's the only way we're going to know if the strategy was right or not. It's the only way we're going to know if it works, is to be consistent. And so I think that part is maybe missed in a lot of conversations, and it's just assumed that, hey, we all said we are agreement, so I guess we're all going to actually go out and execute it in exactly this way. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah, or sometimes it's like the lack of honesty in the skill gap. Because that's what I think of when I think of inconsistency, is that the strategy is built by some people that have specific skills and capabilities, and they just assume that everybody is capable of delivering at that same level. And then what you find out is the strategy that was built works well for the person who built it, and then the others that are trying to make it happen are not as consistent, and they have different actions and decisions. And it's not that they're not trying, they're just not at that skill capability to deliver on the same level of consistency that the other person has.
I think that when that happens, a strategy can't just be high level, we're going to do this high level thing, and then all of a sudden we win. That's why a solid strategy has to have component parts of it where you can benchmark along the way whether or not those things are there. And so if a person is not being able to execute, if you don't have the ability in that moment to figure out whether or not they're not executing because they're not bought into it, or they're not executing because they don't have the skills to do it, if you're not able to look very quickly and see which one of those things it is, it means you didn't bake in the right controls into the strategy to figure out, whether or not you can validate your actions going forward. A strategy is nothing without your ability to validate it. There are two other ones that Dr. Sniukas mentions on here. One is rigidity, the inability to adapt or change, and another one is conformity, no creative edge. I look at those as really similar to each other here. When it comes to people executing a strategy, they will be more likely to buy into that strategy when they can put their own personal touch on it as well. So if you're hyper defining every single element of this to the point where people can't bring their own elements of who they are to the process, it's going to be really difficult to have buy-in from people to make that happen, unless you're talking like the military or something where it has to be rigid and step 1, step 2, step 3. In most organizations, a strategy doesn't have to be that rigid. The rigid part can be, the things that we must get done, the things that we can't change, and then everything else should kind of be left to people, local leaders or leaders of smaller teams or individuals to kind of bring their own spin to it, because that's how you figure out whether or not it's being executed correctly in some parts of an organization versus others. But it also allows them to feel like they're not just being told what to do and they're a robot. They're being valued for the kind of the nuances they can bring to the execution, and they're not being asked to just work exactly like their coworkers might be working.
I agree completely. Like, you have to create some space here to allow leaders to leverage their strengths and then be able to kind of make up for their opportunities. So I think of it like in this context of a larger strategy for maybe like a company, an organization, or like multiple markets or whatever that might be. You're going to have some adaptation that needs to happen as a result of maybe something going on locally. It could be everything from hours of operation to demographics of customers to whatever that might be. But there needs to be a little bit of movement there that you can have to change it slightly to still be able to fall within the framework of the strategy, but allow there to be some uniqueness to it. And then the conformity, like you have to. I think the best strategies are ones that are clear in impact. They're clear in what the result is that we're going after. It is aligned with the priorities of an organization as they've defined, but they also give the teams a little space there to say, like, there may be a little bit of a different take that you could take onto this that would be helpful. There's a little bit of a different way that you might be able to make this a little bit more localized to the team, and that matters. That matters a lot with strategy. It feels much better. You can't always have everybody in the room, and there's always going to be strategies that kind of have to be like, here it is, like those in the room to help develop this larger strategy have been here. This is what's been decided. Here it is for you. But there has to be a little space in there where a team can be a little creative and make it theirs, because then that I think has a lot more impact and a lot more stickiness when a team can take a larger strategy kind of in the macro and bring it into the micro and say, and let's make it our strategy. So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, and looking at this list, are there any on here? Inconsistency, complexity, rigidity, ambiguity, conformity, inertia, and diffusion. Any of these 7 that you look at, and the first thing you think is, it takes you right back to a time when this exact thing happened to you, when a strategy, when you could see it was a good strategy, but it just wasn't working because of, you could see that one of these things was happening, and maybe you have like a extra spidey sense that goes up when one of these things happens.
All the time. Right now.
Yes.
Right now. There's a strategy that I've had to reread the strategy and the math around why we're doing something like 4 times, and I still don't understand. It's so complex. It like if you can't explain it in 60 seconds, it's too complex. Like, it should be that easy, at least for like the big picture of what the strategy is about, what it's solving for, what the goal is, what some of the expectations are. You don't have to get into all the minutia of it, but once it starts to like get all over the place, and if this, then that, if this, like if it feels like a 1,000-character Excel formula, and I'm just like, where's the comma and the parenthesis? Like it's just too complicated. I see that happen a lot. It makes sense for the person who made it. It doesn't make sense for those that are trying to execute it. Absolutely, for sure. I think the diffusion for me is not that it's necessarily like no clear priorities. It just might not be aligned with the priorities that we just talked about 30 minutes ago or yesterday.
So constantly changing priorities.
Yeah, like that will destroy a strategy so fast, because then I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like, this isn't even aligned with what we talked about yesterday. So like, I don't know how much I'm going to put effort into this. Like, because now I got to hedge my bets here. Like, which one is going to win? So like, I don't know if I'm going to get my full effort into this. So that's definitely something that I would say sticks out to me. That as a leader, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I need more clarity here. I need to understand this because it's not aligned with what we just said.
Yeah, I think another thing that I think of when I hear no clear priorities, and this is just from a long history of seeing this happen. Even if you don't have, 2 competing parts of the business who seem to have different priorities, and now you're left thinking, okay, whose coattails do I need to stand on here? Because one person's, drive or push for the organization, the organization has that person's ear right now, but maybe not this person. So I need to, choose my priorities based on the, almost the politics of the moment. But what I see also happen is when priorities change and they start conflicting with each other over time. Not when you have to choose between two in the same time, but when there's a priority for a quarter and then another quarter comes up and then the priority is not just different than the previous quarter, because that's fine. Priorities can change. But when the strive for the priority of the current quarter actually goes in the opposite direction, or in the spirit of being against the priority of the previous quarter or a previous year. And it's almost like, how many times can you tell your people something that changes or that differs and expect them to just forget what they pushed for 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a year ago? You need to really have a compelling reason as to why the direction is changing so much, so where the priority is not just different than the previous one, but goes against the previous one. If you're going to do that, it's not always a bad thing, but you need to be able to explain very articulately why that's happening. Otherwise, you're going to have people who think that these goals or priorities just change arbitrarily based on whatever number you want to move on a scorecard. And that's not a good way to make people feel like they're part of something larger than themselves.
Absolutely. And one thing I would highlight is I love the fact that he calls out that this is destroying a solid strategy, meaning that there are minimum expectations. There are bad strategies and they're just bad strategies. But this is a good, solid strategy that is not being executed because of one of these things. So I love that part. And with that, it brings us to this episode's 1 Minute Hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
All right, for this episode's 1 Minute Hack, here's what I want you to do. Think about the last strategy that you were in charge of implementing or designing or executing that didn't work out the way you wanted it to, the last strategy that failed. It's very easy to pick apart a strategy and figure out where it failed if it was a poor strategy. But if you're scratching your head and thinking, I don't know why this strategy failed, think about it in the context of these 7 things. We'll put the descriptions we'll put the words in the podcast descriptions so you can read them. Inconsistency, complexity, rigidity, ambiguity, conformity, inertia, and diffusion are all reasons why a solid strategy can fail. So before you throw out a strategy that may have been a good strategy and assume that there was something you're missing somewhere, that it just wasn't a good strategy, think about it through the lens of these 7 things and make sure that it wasn't just a great strategy that wasn't executed in the right way, as opposed to going back to the drawing board and redesigning a new strategy.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1 minute hack. And it's, so much of this, and I think just in learning in leadership development and self-development, is around this just idea of self-reflection and thinking about, when these things fall apart. To your point, like a bad strategy is a bad strategy. Like there's a lot of things that the timing was wrong. It was maybe like kind of like tone deaf to a degree of what's going on. There wasn't any collaboration that was done. There wasn't any dialogue. It's pretty easy to be like, well, I can tell you exactly why that didn't work, right? It's much tougher, again, when you're scratching your head being like, this really should have worked. Where did this go wrong? Mm-hmm. These things I think they're great examples of like where to start, what to look at, what to consider. And then start to to peel that back and like maybe where were there some assumptions that were made on behalf of those building the strategy, or things that weren't considered when you're thinking about like lack of clear direction, right? And from an ambiguity standpoint, you could say like I thought it was pretty direct with like what we're going to do here, but if your team is not clear in the direction, not you thinking that you're clear, but if it landed with a team in a way that they were not clear about it, you need to get that insight. You need to spend the time asking some of these questions. And that's probably what I would do with this is like, all right, what do I think it was? But what questions would I ask? How would I verify or validate that it was inconsistency that caused this? Or how did I verify that it was too complex or not? Right. Was I able to explain it in 60 seconds? Was my leader who I shared this with, were they able to explain it in 60 seconds or less? Like these are things that you can do to really verify and validate what was going on.
Yeah, that's spot on. I also think this is a good list to keep with you when you're creating a strategy, because some of them are truly about the way the execution is, but some of it can be referenced during the course of creating a strategy. Things like complexity or or diffusion of not having clear priorities. These are things that to consider as you're going through the strategy, because when you're creating one, to be able to check off some of these boxes and say, okay, it's not overly complicated. It's not too rigid. It lets people kind of bring their own spin on things. These are things that can help the strategy when you leave the room with the people who all put it together, and you have to say, ready, break, and you go execute it. Now, going out of those meetings with this in mind will probably make those people more likely to execute it in a way that sets it up for success. And you'll have to do, kind of less of this reflecting later on to try to figure out why a strategy that was otherwise good failed. Because it's really tough to revisit a good strategy that has failed, even if it was a good strategy. Meaning if these are the reasons it failed, but it was a good strategy, it's much harder to get people's buy-in and kind of reinvigorate them around a process that has already failed once. So if you can prevent it from failing to begin with, that's always a better route.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.